Good evening. I'm Zoltan Bodas, Vice President and Membership Director for Regina's Roll and Groom chapter of the CAHS. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Patrick Groop, a longtime friend. Pat started his long career in aviation at age 16 when he joined 703 Air Cadet Squadron in Regina. Pat got a very early glider scholarship at 16 and a program out of Penhold near Red Deer, Alberta. Then a flying scholarship the following year out of the Regina Flying Club. After university, Pat decided to get this commercial ticket along with all the ratings. And he started to fly for Regina's Grizzly International Air. He even did a stint in the British Virgin Islands for Air BVI, flying on schedule and charter flights. Upon returning to Canada, he flew for a small Alberta-based company called Scott Brothers Aviation. He started on pipeline patrol out of Regina and eventually relocated to Alberta with the firm. The company grew and expanded, and his duties initially included pilot and then on to chief pilot. Pat's role also led into business development work and sales for about 6 years before John Scott Dopel decided to sell his business. As part of the business evolution, the firm had gotten into specialty air photo survey work. The folks buying the company weren't interested on this side of the business. John offered it to Pat to buy, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, 37 years later, Pat is retiring at the end of 2022. So now, please join us as Pat fills us in on the rest of the story, along with some interesting history about air photo survey in Canada.
Good evening, folks. Thanks very much. Appreciate the invitation to come and have a chat with you. I was giving this some thought as to how best present this, and photography and aerial survey in particular is sort of goes back a long way back to the start of cameras, and even before the start of airplanes, folks were deciding that they should try to see the Earth from other than ground level. So early days had a lot of interesting things, and I'll try to do a little bit of a history for you and then kind of bring you up to the modern era. But, cameras were first kind of invented in the early part of the 18th century. And then in and around 1958, there was a Frenchman by the name of Gaspard Tournichon. He was more commonly known by the name of Nadar, and he was both a photographer and a balloonist. And he wanted to be able to try some aerial photography from a balloon. Back in the day, photography was very primitive, and they used what they called a collodion process. So in his hot air balloon, he basically had to have a dark room, and he was able to do some photography from a tethered balloon at 80 meters, basically in the French countryside. And none of that image survives today. About the earliest image that was ever taken from the air, from a balloon that survives, is from Boston around the 1860s. And a chap, same thing, had a tethered balloon, and he did that work from a balloon. Basically, the early years before airplanes, we had kites, we had pigeons, and we had rockets. And of course, balloons were the earliest stab at aerial photography. And there was real improvement in photo techniques and technology with different processes. You may all have heard of the term daguerreotype process. That came along after this collodion, made photography a little bit easier, but they still had very long exposures and pretty hard to get good photography from something that was in the air, bouncing and moving around, whether it was in a balloon or even on a kite. There's actually a very famous photograph taken in 1906 of San Francisco after the earthquake and the fire. And that was done with a very large format, very heavy, custom-made panoramic camera. And the gentleman that lifted this camera off employed 17 kites all stacked up on top of each other to lift this thing, got it up to about 2,000 feet, And there's a famous photograph of the harbor and San Francisco in the background, basically with a lot of destroyed buildings and smoldering buildings and everything else. So kites were employed, mostly taking, land scenes, towns, that kind of thing. And interestingly enough, I wish I could show you the picture of a pigeon with a camera strapped to his chest or its chest. That was early on. A chap, again, a Frenchman by the name of Julius Nerbronner, designed a small 70-gram camera that they could mount to the breast of a pigeon. These were carrier pigeons, usually for military use. They would strap the camera on and they would have timed automatic exposures, but you were a bit pot luck in the route that you got. The bird would fly off and you would just snap pictures from the air as he was flying along. I think the military would hope that they'd get the odd good photograph that they might find useful. But in any event, we had all these early efforts from balloons, kites, and even carrier pigeons. And we even got into rockets. Actually, the famous Albert Nobel in 1897 developed a rocket, and he would fire that up and it would carry camera systems, and they would get view of ground scenes, usually of some kind of town or community. Also, a German chap by the name of Albert Moll was right on his heels. Same thing, some of the rockets were powdered fired, and the German chap even had sort of a compressed air method to launch his rocket. But of course, with the Wright brothers, by 1912, airplanes had matured. They had become far more effective platforms for photo. And first aircraft images were actually taken with the Wright brothers, 1908 and 1909, still photograph as well as motion pictures when they were doing demo flights in Europe for different French government as well as the Italian military. And that kind of takes us a little bit into, I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but photography had come a long way. We'd gone from glass plates that were both wet and dry, and we're now evolving. Cameras are getting better, and the emulsion and the films are getting better. In 1879, we had George Eastman. If people recall the last name, that's Eastman Kodak for you. He discovered a formula for making a successful gelatin emulsion that he could cover on a dry plate. Again, a lot of glass plate photography, large, bulky, difficult cameras to use, totally of no ideal purpose in an airborne application and something bouncing and moving along, set for a studio on the ground where people could sit still and you could get long exposures. With this invention, he was able to coat a special roll paper film. And it wasn't too long after that, I think about 1889, his company produced a flexible celluloid film. And basically the rest is history. He actually needed a camera for his film. And in 1890, he made for $1 a box camera, and you've heard the name, he called it a Brownie. After you took the picture, you'd send the camera and film in. It would get processed. He would return the camera with a new roll of film with your prints, and you're ready to go for the second go round. All this development, of course, set the stage for further developments in aerial photo films, color films, IR films, better resolution films, and also hat in hand with that, there was again camera developments and stuff. Basically, we kind of get into human conflict. Nothing like conflict and wars to kind of really push technology change and advancement. And as we got into World War I, of course, we had reasonable numbers of platforms now, military aircraft. You're all familiar with the different types, the Fokker triplanes, Sopwith and all the other different kinds of aircraft that were around, even the larger bombers and the observer type airplanes. So almost from the get-go, they found that there were benefits over human observation and sketch maps with aerial photography. I heard a cute anecdote when I was researching this a little bit, that a German observation airplane had an observer that was looking down on the British lines, and they saw what looked like a unit in total disarray, almost in panic, running around carrying on, and it turned out it was a British soccer match. So the photography certainly would give you a little bit more reliability. And at the end of the day, they used it in spades. Probably the British forces they took over 5 million images, even in the last year of the war, let alone in the earlier days. They would run sorties on a regular basis. Probably by the end of the war, they were recording the entire front even twice a day. So they were really using photography, both oblique and vertical, in World War I. They would stitch together images to be able to create a mosaic, to get an idea of the trench design and structures, and get an idea about troop movements, troop buildups, all the necessary military reconnaissance and kind of spying that you really wanted to do, and see where you're at with most of the stuff. Again, cameras were mounted on the outside of the aircraft, both oblique and vertical. They certainly had better results for mapping and mapping accuracy with vertical. Oblique would be, mostly something that would give you an overview, but doesn't have the accuracy and the positioning and the reference to maps that you would get if you had vertical imagery. Camera designs were poor, especially again for aircraft. And, image wasn't really that good. One of the developments that had come along came from actually a chap by the name of Sherman Fairchild. He developed a camera with a shutter that was located inside the lens. And it was actually revolutionary because it reduced the distortion that was a result of a movement from the aircraft. He also designed an intervalometer that allowed the photos to be taken at any interval. And that way, if you're flying along, you can take pictures very rapidly or slower. You can get different overlaps to help you put image together for mosaic and mapping purposes. With his modifications, Fairchild really created a family of cameras, and it became the premier aerial camera system for survey for almost 50 years. His cameras even flew in the shuttle. And he was also an early innovator. After the war, military wasn't very interested in all these innovations and developments. And in the States, he was able to commercialize his aerial photography. He was one of the first people to get into suburban photo, did Manhattan Island. Even East Haven, Connecticut wanted a up-to-date survey done that was actually going to take 5 years and cost about 80 grand. With aerial photography, he was able to complete it in 60 days for $7,000. And he also even got into forestry, actually coming up into Canada, working for Laurentide Pulp and Paper. And I think in his first project with them, he did close to 510 square kilometers, which would have been quite an accomplishment in the day, photographing sort of remote, pristine forests with the idea of access and seeing what they had for both tree types and species to see about their commercial viability and all that kind of good stuff. So that was really important endeavors out of the United States with Sherman Fairchild. He even designed or had designed photo survey specific aircraft. I forget the exact type. It was something like FC-1. If you were to look at it, it of course had a round exposed engine, but it would remind you almost of a Super Cub, high wing, tail dragger, struts, but it was at least enclosed, and you could keep the pilot and the camera operator comfortable and inside, away from the elements, and you could even apply a little bit of heat and stuff to it. So it was a really big improvement. Specifically to get to Canada, we early on had a surveyor general by the name of Captain DeVille, and he was our survey general from 1885 to 1924. Actually, I think he died in office. And he was a very early innovator and developer, and he put in a lot of pioneering efforts to introduce photography. He really started off with terrestrial photography, found that, you know, with the kind of terrain and landmass that Canada was, they were doing photography from tripods on mountaintops. The fact that you had image of terrain and scene, you could make that easier to, you know, you didn't have to sketch, you didn't have to draw, you didn't manually kind of misplace and misrepresent things. So you had all this aerial photography. They had really good success with the terrestrial mountaintop stuff, and he wanted to get that into the world of aviation. So he was an early pioneer. Britain kindly donated to Canada a couple of Vickers Vikings that were flying boats, had an open kind of cockpit at the front where a person could hand hold a camera and lean over and take pictures. And that's actually kind of got us going. We really, in the intervening years, 1921 to, you know, the start of World War II, kind of 1939 timeframe. The Air Force, of course, wasn't commissioned or come into existence till 1924, but it was really through the Air Force in Canada in those intervening years, working again with people like the Surveyor General of Canada, we were getting photography done of Canada in those early years in the 20s and 30s. The Air Force was new, it was growing. One of its mandates was aerial photography. In those years, probably on an average, they did as well as 1,000 to 2,000 hours of aerial photography across the country in any one season. A lot of the stuff they were doing in the day would be for towns and cities, but there was also forestry application, resource application, and it was pretty important stuff. Some of our earliest photo was Ottawa and Dartmouth in the 1920s, where they were trying to establish processes, procedures. This was all very still new, and all the technology was needing integration. What worked, what didn't work, how was this going to work for us for topographic surveys? Really, you've got cameras early days, but they're not mapping cameras. In today's world, we have these modern, we had film, and now we have digital metric mapping cameras. These are precision, highly specialized cameras and pieces of equipment, because at the end of the day, when it comes to mapping, it's all about measurements, and it's taking this image, which is your source data, and it's sort of sucking it to the ground and fitting it into the real world and eliminating the distortion that you get from 3D, because a picture from up in space, whether it's 1,000 feet up or 5,000 feet up, is two-dimensional and it's flat. So it's all about measurement, and there's a whole study of photogrammetry, and there's textbooks written on this stuff. We're not going to get into the weeds on that, because that's a whole different world all by itself. Has all the mathematics and the geometry all associated with it. But at the end of the day, shortly after the Air Force in 1924, in 1925, the government formed the National Air Photo Library and what we in trade call ICAS, ICAS, a great bureaucratic name, meaning Interdepartmental Committee on Aerial Surveys. And it was responsible for all non-military aerial photography standards, specifications, and they also were basically a project developer and coordinator. And it's through them that, projects were, put out for flying. And again, in the early years, mostly the Air Force did this. Again, a lot of town and urban stuff, some resource stuff, and even rural and crop photography, especially during the Depression and the Dust Bowl timeframe. The Air Force was out and about doing photography, for even back then, whatever you want to call it, climate change or other kinds of problems. They were involved in that, as well as all the other photography that they were doing as they were growing and developing. Early on, we're getting photography to support Trans-Canada Highway, St. Lawrence Seaway, Labrador Rail Line, and again, later on, helping with opening the North and all that kind of good stuff. World War II comes along, and we, of course, ceased anything that was, domestic, other than maybe taking photographs of where we're putting in British Commonwealth Air Training Plan bases. But other than that, everybody went off to do war. That's a whole topic in its own right, World War II, aerial reconnaissance, and a whole bunch of other good stuff. I'm going to post this later. I'll get it to Zoltan or to Gary, but there's a pretty good book that was put out by this Constance Babington Smith, and she was part of the British Air Force and all that reconnaissance work and military photography that was done in the war. It probably was very, very instrumental in helping to win the war. The Germans were pretty strong at the start of the war, and then they fell off. And we just kept getting, as the Allies, better and better with all of the stuff. The Mosquitoes were used as reconnaissance bombers. They went in after bombing raids to do photography to show how good or how bad the bombing was. A lot of stuff was done, and it was actually aerial reconnaissance and photography that confirmed the V2 rocket sites and development at Peenemünde. And they were able, from that information, to go in and bomb it into destruction to sort of stop those V2 rocket attacks by the Germans on London towards the end of the war. And that's a whole new, that's a whole area alone, what came out of World War II and all the technology advantages. Even the Americans going in, they were absolutely Luddites and beginners in aerial reconnaissance intelligence. And by the end of the war, they had earned their spurs and were probably the best of everybody. So that would bring us to the end of the war and coming back to Canada. And really interesting time frame. We had a great big huge country that we really didn't know too much about, and great unexplored territory, particularly in the Arctic. And the government of the day decided that they would task the Air Force to try and go and photograph all of the Canadian North and Arctic and everywhere in between. And in May of 1944, they formed the No. 7 Photo Wing, and it was actually established in Rockcliffe. And they were not a small outfit, almost 300 personnel. They started off with 3 Spitfires, a Hurricane, 5 Ansons, 3 Mitchells, Cancel, and a Norseman. And they went off and started doing photo, particularly higher altitude photo, kind of 20,000 feet and more. And in the spring of 45, they started planning in a really serious way for extensive photography of the North. They had an ambitious program. They wanted about 200,000 square miles covered by vertical photography and about 300,000 square miles by what they call a trimetragon system. Most aerial photography, all of it today, is done with a single vertical camera. There was a methodology in the day where you had a vertical camera plus two oblique cameras set at fixed angles, and it would give you much wider coverage. So it had the advantage of that. And because of their fixed angle, they still had the geometry, so they could come back, and with the vertical and the two obliques, they could still end up being able to do proper, accurate, mapping from that. And so away they went. The Air Force went out every year. They had various successes over the different years. Obviously, we have a limited photo season in Canada, running from snow melt or early spring, April down our way, certainly much later up in the north in the Arctic. And, we've got seasonal problems and variables, forest fire, smoke, weather, etc. But at the end of the day, they would go out, chase weather, and do as much as they can. But they actually had as many as 3 squadrons. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure of the number of aircraft in each squadron at the time, but these folks would go out. When they were really doing the Arctic, they would send a group to Frobisher Bay, which is a Iqaluit. They would go to Whitehorse. They would go to Yellowknife. They would go to Nuvik and various other places to base out of and to work in their particular region, large areas of photo. They were covering very large areas, lines of 100, 200 kilometers long, and they really had nothing to go by. They were using navigation techniques from World War II. There was a system called SHORAN, which they employed. They had to send out ground crews remotely, and these SHORAN would give off, excuse me for a minute, I got to reference this correctly for you. The SHORAN would give off signals that would allow these guys to accurately note their position. And they emitted radar pulses, and they could establish precise distance between various points and draw their flight lines on that. So it was a pretty big operation. They went out, and various years brought, various successes. Again, 45, 46, they only got 186,000 square miles. Yet in 46, 47, they did 355,000 square miles. So it varied over the years. And the Royal Canadian Air Force, with their Lancaster operation, again, they had a variety of airplanes. The Lancasters came a little bit later, and they were really great. They had long endurance, high altitude. Most of the photography we're doing was at least 20 or 30,000 feet. And so you're getting lots of coverage and on any one photo. So the less image you got, the less image you have to map, and the quicker and the less expensive your mapping is going to be. So it was a major endeavor requiring a lot of people on the ground. They flew long hours with the daylight up there. They weren't really worried too much about sun angle, but I guess in 19, give me a second. The final total for this one season in 48 was 911,000 square miles. So that's quite a few airplanes doing a lot of photography. And so 49 to 50, 870,000 square miles. And in 50 to 51, 869,000 square miles. So I think all of the country got photographed in that really key time after the war, 45 into the sort of early 50s, with the Air Force things got cut back as conflict in Korea heated up, and the Air Force was less and less able to, continue with this particular mapping program. But it was probably one of the Air Force's finest post-war achievements. And at the end of the day, pretty hard to beat. Later on, mid-50s to the late 50s, we basically started seeing the rise of commercial operators. You good folks with the Calgary chapter might appreciate it and even know more than I do. But one of the earlier firms to do photo survey was Spartan. And they went through a variety of different airplanes, but their most successful airplane was the Mosquito. And I understand they went to the UK and bought about 15 of them. Really good deal, $1,500 a piece, I understand. There's currently in Nanton at the Bomber Museum a Spartan aircraft being rebuilt by sort of the Calgary Mosquito Association. And it's well underway. There's a big volunteer group and they work away on it. I believe they do volunteer nights on Saturdays and Tuesdays, and it's called the Calgary Mosquito Aircraft Society. And they're getting that all set to hopefully rebuild and put all together. It's a pretty interesting endeavor. And if you guys are ever going by or want to check it out, please go online. There's a really great video. I think if you were to type in Spartan aerial surveys, you'll see a bit of a video made by this society where you can see the Mosquito flying and where you can see some of their activity up in the Canadian Arctic. They were a pretty big outfit, Spartan. They ran quite a variety of aircraft. They even had Ansons, Venturas. They even ran a Lancaster, Sea Hornet, Cansos, DC-3s. They did aerial photography. They did airborne geophysical mag work. They ran helicopters. They were pretty big right through to the 70s. They would fly in and around Canada, continued to do a lot of Canadian high Arctic work, and went overseas, usually in the winter, a lot of stuff in South America or the Caribbean and even Africa, during our winter season and off season. So they were definitely a success story, but they were a really big organization built for very big, large projects. And they slowly came to an end as, the country got photographed. CAHS certainly stayed a player in aerial photography well into the 90s on the federal government side, but they were doing less and less photography and more seemed to be taken up by the provinces. NAPL, the National Air Photo Library, at the end of the day, is the repository for a lot of this film, going all the way back to 20s, all the way up to now. And they probably have over 6 million images, and it can all be accessed. And, you can get maps, you can get images, and you can, go on their web page and figure out how to order stuff if you're interested. Equally, most provinces have they've got fairly well developed and reasonably decent sized photo programs. A lot of them also have their own film repositories too, that have their own inventory of film. And after Spartan and the bigger outfits went, Canada had quite a few photo survey firms, but it was a specialized industry and business. Basically, if you're in the business, you're a commercial operator. You do specialty air photo survey work. There's all kinds of firms that have come and gone over the years. And late in the 50s, mid 50s, there was not a lot of new camera development work. Zeiss out of Germany, Herberg or Wild out of Switzerland developed newer metric mapping cameras. really beautiful camera systems, wonderful technology. They improved over time with, you take the Vild or the what we call the Leica family of cameras. They started off with RC5 and ended up with RC30. They had RC5, RC8, RC10, RC20, RC30, just different film types as they advanced and got better. Generally more electronics, more automation, better lenses, and of course, films continue to grow and evolve. Kodak was always big in the aerial film, and a European firm out of Belgium, Agfa, was also a big player in the film industry. And we stayed with large format film in our industry right till really 2013, 2015. Digital systems were expensive, and we really needed the marketplace to jump on the bandwagon to make that transition from film into digital. And that's happened, and pretty much everything is digital now. Probably one of the bigger manufacturers in the digital world is Vexel. They're an Austrian company based out of Graz, and they make a family of cameras called the Ultracam. But backing up for a little bit, I'm going to sort of just shift out of that history I gave you, and I'm just going to run a little bit into my world. In my flying, I got working for a firm called Scottopole Brothers Aviation. We were a charter company here in Alberta, and I worked for these two brothers on that operation. And we got to be fairly big with a base in Edmonton and Calgary, running quite a few Navajos, King Air, Twin Otter, mostly on charter, supporting oil and gas industry and other kinds of activity, pipeline patrol, whatever. And we got into the specialty world of aerial photography for survey and mapping. And that was most interesting. Hadn't done it before. It's mostly government-related work. You're working for Crown Corporation, provincial government department. In your world over in Saskatchewan, Central Surveys and Mapping was a big user of aerial photography. They would contract and tender it out. It then got morphed into the Information Services Corporation. And right now in Saskatchewan, you've got a fairly major photo survey program. It's now in its fourth 5-year period. So you're now into its 20th year. It's managed through the Saskatchewan Research Council. And there's probably at least 20 to 24 organizations that belong to the Saskatchewan Geospatial Image Collaborative. And they all put their dibs in on what they want photographed around the province. And SRC manages and handles that particular project. They basically do photography on large, full 250,000 map sheets. And it's usually 30 centimeter photography. And that photography is all then put into orthophoto. Orthophoto is simply an image map. If I'm at a cocktail party and I tell people I do aerial photography for making maps, their eyes glaze over. But if I say I'm Google from an airplane, they understand. So it's an image map. And in our world, we call that orthophoto. Most maps, as you know, are a representation of the real world. We use symbology, blue blobs for lakes and blue lines squiggling for rivers, different lines for highways and symbols for towns and churches and all kinds of stuff. And, you know, boundary lines for counties and RMs and all kinds of goodies. So maps, topographic maps are most often representations, but the image, the picture, was always the source data for building those maps. And the image always had the inherent ability to become the map, except it was prohibitively expensive in the days of analytical and analog mapping machines to be able to do a picture map. And it's only with the advent of really computer technology and digital systems that digital imagery and orthophoto has really come into its own. In the day of film, when orthophoto was first started out, the only economical solution was 30,000, 60,000 scale, 30,000 foot photo, because you would cover a full township with one picture, but you needed a stereo image to do an orthophoto. So you'd take two pictures to cover a township. Take the flying out of the equation to stitch those two pictures together into a picture map or an orthophoto cost $1,000. To do the same thing today costs you 50 bucks. So it's really a big difference in the way technologies come. The camera systems were fairly expensive in their day. They probably got as much as $750,000. Film itself was expensive. Our film roll cameras, by the way, were in the order of 450 to 550 pounds. They were different components. There'd be a mount, a lens, drive unit, magazine or film cassettes, control panels, navigation aids, navigation sight. They'd all be put in an airplane, modified with a camera hatch and a hole. Typically, mostly light twin engine airplanes, Navajos. We operated a Cessna through 310 for the longest time. King Air 200, put them in a Twin Otter, anything that basically you could think of as a modern general aviation airplane. As long as it had the size to handle the camera, it could handle a system. We currently operate a Cessna 206, as well as a Piper Navajo and a Piper Malibu, but it's a jet prop. A Malibu was originally a piston, and we run a turbine Malibu, which is a really nice airplane to have because of its performance and ability to fly high altitude and get up there quickly. So the camera systems were fairly big. They weighed a bit, but again, they were precise metric mapping cameras. They had to be calibrated at the National Research Council every year and to make sure that they still were intact and stable and could do the job they were designed to do. Our rolls of film were anywhere from 200 to 500 feet in length, and our negatives are 9 inches by 9 inches. And our photography is taken with 60% forward overlap, going down a line, and your photo blocks are designed so that there's 30% lateral coverage from line to line. That way you can stitch together 100, 10, 1,000, 10,000 pictures and make them one uniform picture, suck them to the ground and make a map out of it. And at the end of the day, you had big, large film processors that would be continuous film roll processors that would be able to process that film. From there, your film roll came out. It had to be checked for flight recovery, annotated, meaning it had to have ink annotation or marking put on the film. It all, basically a roll of film got edited like a book. And every frame was annotated that was used. You had a flight report that detailed everything like a table of contents, and you would also do a detailed index map. So you'd take a topographic map, and then you would draft on that all your flight lines, your photo centers, so that you could look at the map and you could see that this image on this line from this film roll is in this location on God's green earth. And if that was the area you're interested in getting a picture or a group of pictures for, you could then order it. And that was the film day. Those were the kind of deliverables that you gave to the client. And then from there, it would and could go into the photo mapping process. And again, I mentioned we're not going to get into the weeds on photogrammetry, but in the day, we had these very large, very expensive $250,000 analytical and analog plotters. You would do slide images from your film called diapositives. Two of them would sit up in a staging area. You'd look through binoculars and you could see in 3 dimension. As human beings, we have binocular vision, and a stereo pair look through a stereoscope, you can see in 3D. And of course, it's from that you're able to do a digital elevation model and then build contour and topographic maps. And that's the whole downstream process. Again, making orthophotos, doing contour maps, planimetric mapping, cadastral survey work, everything else. So from the film world, we then gravitated into the digital world, and that really, getting into that world, you realized how much hassle film actually was. Film got scratched, film got dirty, film got dusty, film could get stuck in the film processor. You could have a whole myriad of problems. Your film could get fogged. Even flying around in an airplane with film in it that you're carrying, you had to make sure you didn't get heat fog on a 90-degree day. So the world of digital is a lot easier. Also with today's systems, you can actually fly a flight line, and after a few seconds or a minute or so, you can bring up the line you flew and just look at your image to evaluate that the start and the end of the line are perfect, that you don't have any cloud, that you don't have any shadow or anything else. Also, jumping backwards for a second, I mentioned with the film camera systems, these navigation sites. So in the day, there was a lot of visual navigation. Even in the 50s, certainly the Air Force, they required pilot, navigator, and camera operator. Even Spartan in their Mosquitoes, camera, operator, navigator, and pilot. We could, with the newer camera systems, actually combine the navigator and the camera operator, because the cameras could be set up, turned on, and basically run automatically without much trouble. And at the same time, that person could then focus on the navigation down the navigation site and keep the pilot lined up. Typically, a project is going to be drawn out on a topographic map. They've got that in hand, they've got their flight lines, and they can follow from each line as they go down line, see the ground, see visually they're in the right location, and then keep the pilot online. Obviously, with the advent of GPS, that changed that world rather quickly. With GPS nowadays, everything is planned. We put our projects on a USB stick. We put it in a laptop computer that's in the airplane, and there's a specialized flight management system. You load your projects, you bring it up, you bring up your project, you bring up your line, you give it a direction, and the pilot has a display panel, and it gives him everything he needs to accurately fly his line. And there's really very little reflights required due to gaps or botched lines. And the systems are even set up that the image is taken automatically with predetermined photo centers. So you come in on a photo line on a project, the system is all armed, and as long as the pilot's flying you accurately, and there's no reason he shouldn't, he's on GPS, he should be bang on his line right on the spot. The camera fires when you get to the start point, and it quits when you get to the end point. All you have to do is look at it, say it's good, bring up your next line, and away you go. And like I say, we just keep mowing the lawn. If you're doing a block of photography over an RM or a rural municipality, you're just going back and forth on your line. I didn't talk about scale. I'm going to jump sideways on that. In the days of film, when you heard a scale like 1 to 60,000, 1 to 50, 1 to 40, 1 to 30, 1 to 5, it was really very easy. You divided that number by half to get your flying height. So 1 to 60 would be 30,000 feet above the ground, pretty high. And 1 to 5,000 would be 2,500 feet above the ground. Pretty low, large scale. High altitude, small scale. Your flying height is a function of the mapping requirement and the project requirements. In today's world, there's a lot of low-level, large-scale urban photography. typically in the order of 1 to 5,000 scale. In the world of digital, we call it 4 or 5 centimeter, 7 centimeter GSD. We're flying close to the ground because you want to see the manhole cover. You want to see the fire hydrant. You need to measure the height of the curb from the road to the sidewalk. And you want to know that the spot in the backyard is Spot's doghouse, not a spot, because it'll be a spot from 30,000 feet, but not from 2,000 feet. So urban photography, city photography is done generally low level, large scale for the detail that they're after. And if you're doing more province-wide, county-wide, RM-wide photo, forestry photo, that kind of stuff, it's often higher altitude, smaller scale, and you're after less detail, but you're also after economy. You cannot fly a map sheet at 1 to 5,000 scale economically where you can at 30 centimeters. Even at 30 centimeters, it's going to take you probably 20 lines and take you about 5,000 line kilometers and run you about 3,000 pictures. And large scale would just be off the wall and not at all economical in this case. So the scale comes into play. It's a function of the kind of project that you're doing. What kind of people use our work? Well, again, mainly government. Federal government use it across all kinds of departments. Provincial governments, crown corporations use it. A lot of highway photography, a lot of forestry photography, a lot of environmental photography, parks photography, anything that you can think of that might need mapping, might need assessment, might need some science, some research. You could just be flying cropland for crop health, for soil assessment. False color infrared photography, if you're to look at it, everything that is a chlorophyll or a green is a burgundy, a magenta, a maroon, or a red. It's really good for crop plant health analysis assessment. It even highlights wet spots, like for hydrography. It shows up really jet black. And at the end of the day, specialized film, but it's also available in the digital world, specialized application. In today's world, without film anymore, pretty much everything gets done color. In the day, a roll of black and white would be $500. A roll of color would be $1,200, and a roll of false color infrared would be $2,000. And it would be the same amount to process it. Black and white, 500, color, 1,200, and false color infrared, $2,000 to process it. And then from there, you still got to do your finishing work, contact prints, diapositive, and other things. So it was always a bit of an expensive process, the stuff. So mostly fell to government or industry. Certainly we would do mining photography. Aerial photography can be used for volume calculations. Procter & Gamble did photography out of Grand Prairie for many years over their log yard. They would fly their log yard and they could calculate right down to a couple of board feet what they had in inventory from doing volume calculations in their log yard. There's hardly any jurisdiction in Canada that doesn't do photography. Everybody's got various programs. I mentioned the Saskatchewan one. BC had a very large trim program for many years. The Northwest Territories, under Municipal and Community Affairs, would do community photography, often low-level, large-scale, and then some higher stuff. As a company, Geodesie's probably flown in the Arctic every year since we've been in business, which is 1986. And there's 64 Indigenous communities in the Canadian Arctic, and we've been to every one probably 2 or 3 times. So, and that's not counting those in the Yukon. But yeah, it's a big, wonderful world up there, and there's still lots of photography, but No big broad reaches are done anymore. It's usually all updated with satellite. And at the end of the day, it's mostly, community or, project specific stuff. You might be doing a pipeline, whether it's planned or actual. You might be doing highway stuff. We actually flew the planned road, all season road from Inuvik to Tuck. And that wasn't that long ago, folks. I think 2017, we flew that for route selection for an all season road. And then it was also flown with LiDAR system. So actually they opened that, I think, in 2018. And so you can actually drive coast to coast to coast. Before, you could only get to Inuvik through the Dempster Highway out of Whitehorse, but now you can drive all the way to Tuck if you want to add that to a bucket list of something you want to do at some point in time. But anything that you could think of that might get benefit from photo and from mapping, that kind of stuff, it's probably been done, tried, or tested. One of the newer innovations is LiDAR, light image detection and ranging. It's not really that new. It's been around for over a decade. It actually has replaced photogrammetry in the manual creation of a digital elevation model and contour maps. With stereo imagery in analytical and analog plotters, you're able to, what we call, put the dot on the ground and build a digital elevation model, and from that create contour maps. Very labor intensive, very uneconomical, and you just can't do it anymore unless you're offshore. And in today's world, LiDAR replaces that. You put an instrument in an airplane and you fly over the ground. You pepper the ground with hundreds of points of light. The speed of light is absolute, and the time difference of the light signal return to your instrument gives you a difference in elevation. And from that, you post-process that into a point cloud. And we do that also in our business. With our 3 airplanes, we have 3 large format mapping cameras, and we also operate a LiDAR system. So we're needing a 4th airplane. So hopefully the new ownership will get one of those this year. And we actually did a very large LiDAR survey project over in Saskatchewan of about 3,800 square kilometers. And it might not seem like a lot, but it took 300 hours to fly it. It was all along the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, kind of Meadow Lake up to La Loche, I guess. In any event, that will be used to create a variety of digital surface products for the forestry folks with the Environment Department out of Prince Albert. So again, photography kind of got the ball rolling, but we really got into the world of remote sensing. And it's not just aerial photography for mapping. Other technologies came into play. Mentioned LiDAR. Going back into the world of geophysical, we never did that in our organization, but you do magnetometer, VLF flying, even radar. Radar is quite important, helps with, we've got radar sat, really helps with mapping the Arctic ice to support safe sea lift operations in the Canadian Arctic in the summer. And of course, we've had satellites for a long time. I just vaguely remember, I think the first one we ever did was Alouette 1. And then, of course, we've gotten into radar sat. We got 2 generations of that. And there's all kinds of earth sensing satellites, from Spot, from Landsat, from all kinds of stuff nowadays. People buying that imagery, using it for all their different, uses and everything else. Getting off track here a little bit, folks, but at the end of the day, as geodesy, our world has been mainly Western Canada and the Arctic. We've developed some specialty work with a Calgary firm in thermal imaging. They're the instrument engineer and design firm. We fly for them and with them doing energy and heat loss studies, usually in the heating season. And also that same instrument is used with wildfire mapping. So we're under contract with the provincial government to provide an airplane and a thermal camera, and we'll go out and we'll be tasked to fly relatively high altitude wildfires. We fly these from about 9 to 9:30 to 10 o'clock at night. We do a full 4.5 hour mission, landing, 1:30 to 2:30. We then have to take that image and turn it over to a ground crew that will turn that into a series of map products for the fire folks. They get a fire perimeter, they get intensely burning areas, and they also get hot spots, both within the fire and outside the fire. And the fire folks, when they start their day, can have that overnight map at hand to figure out how best to deploy their resources, whether it's on the ground with fire crews, equipment, heli-tac crews, or water bombers. And that's something we seem to be getting into more and more as we seem to have more and more fires and smoke on a seasonal basis that we run into. I'm probably running out of time and out of ideas here. There's probably 1,000 different things I can think of, but I've run off my notes, and maybe I should just leave it. I'm really sorry. I had a lot of wonderful images to kind of reinforce all these different things that I've showed you, from pictures of cameras to index maps to flight reports to early history stuff. And maybe I'll get this refined and we can, excuse me, do a revised, more polished presentation at a future time for you.
Pat, just
Yes.
Zoltan here. I know a couple things. If I move my cursor around at the bottom, you get a band, and there's a share screen between
Share
chat and
screen.
reaction. Yeah.
I
you
don't
hit
have
some-
that here.
Oh, I see.
Where you
Okay.
got it?
It's on the bottom. You might have to move your cursor around. to bring-
Just a minute. Okay, give me a second.
The other thing I was going to mention was that, when I let the cursor go, it goes blank. If I move my cursor around near the bottom, it brings it up, and it's got, on the left, it's got mute, stop video, participants, chat, share screen, reactions.
Yeah, this is gonna take a bit of setup, I think.
Try moving the mouse around to the bottom of the screen and back. The other thing is, I don't know if you're done your spiel, but I think we'd like to hear about, I spoke briefly, I think you heard me about, you started out in Air Cadets, as many people did, but maybe a little bit about your career before Geodesy. I don't want to
Sure.
speak with anybody. I know you flew around the Caribbean as a young lad. That
I did
couldn't have been
too.
a bad
Yeah.
thing. That couldn't be a
Yeah,
bad
I
thing.
did too. Yeah,
And then you got your park on and went down to the Antarctic.
I did too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Maybe a
thanks
little
for
bit-
those tidbits. I'll throw those in. Basically, by the way, I didn't kind of wrap that up. When I went to work with Scottapole Brothers, I was a line pilot, then became chief pilot. And John was wheelchair bound from a crop spray accident. So he really didn't have much luck with basic business development and sales. So I kind of ended up doing that for him. I became his legs, I guess, at the end of the day. And again, we got into this photo survey. And when John sold his business in 1986, the folks that took it over didn't want the photo survey. So I ended up buying it and taking it over and ran from there. We started with one airplane with a 310, again, flying mostly around Western Canada, highway departments, that kind of stuff. Got a mapping partner in the early 90s, and then another flying partner in the early 2000s. And so we had an integrated mapping and flying firm. Again, we ran with that and grew into 3 airplanes with the 3 cameras. We were bought out 18 months ago by another mapping firm. So they absorbed us, and they also brought LiDAR technology, and we've been flying LiDAR for the last year and a half also. The other stuff, the fire mapping and those other things we were doing independent of that purchase. So prior to Scottapole Brothers, with cadets, I was in Regina 703, got a gliding scholarship actually out of Penhold. It was really before the gliding program with cadets kicked off. I was one of about 4 or 5 cadets with some adults, and we were based out of Penhold, but we went down to Innisfail and flew out of there. And over the summer, there was some civilian instructors, some of them power pilots. They just had to transition to their glider pilots. And us cadet kids, we had to start from scratch and get our full glider pilot license. And that was a fun season. And then next year I got a flying scholarship and did that through the Regina Flying Club. And then when I went on to university at the University of, at the time it was University of Saskatchewan Regina campus, I was taking business, and for a summer job, I worked with the Air Cadet Gliding Program, and it was bar none the best paid summer holiday and job you could ever have. We worked a couple of years at Penhold. The gliding program grew. Then the Western program, BC went and set up at Nanaimo, and we set up in Rivers, northwest of Brandon. Rivers had been a big military base. It was the first tri-service base, and it was shut down. So here we had this fantastic facility with these fantastic runways, and we had the whole thing to ourselves. So we had a big hangar, but it was a big program. We had 10 gliders, 5 tow planes. We brought 100 kids in for 7 weeks and trained them from ab initio up to passenger carrying status. You know, they got the full range of flying behind a tow plane, learning to fly off a winch, getting up with enough solo hours to fly passengers. So when they went back home to their own squadrons, if they had a gliding program in the spring and the fall, they could fly their own kids if that was going to be in the cards for them. And that was a fun program, a lot of good years, and that was, you know, a pretty good time. After doing that, I went traveling for a year, and when I came back, I ended up going to the Caribbean, and I was in the British Virgin Islands for a season, working with their BVI. We flew DC-3s and Britten Norman Islanders on sched service, mainly from San Juan, Puerto Rico, over to Beef Island, which was in Tortola, the British Virgin Islands. And we'd do other sched runs to the US Virgin Islands and different islands in the Caribbean. It's kind of a fun gig, but the real world called, and I came back and got working with the Scottapole Brothers. Initially worked for them out of Regina for about a year on pipeline patrol, but they grew rather rapidly with aircraft charter supporting the oil patch. And that's what got me into that part of the world. So, but those were early years on the flying side. Decided that not that a business degree didn't stand me in good stead, but I got caught by the flying bug and decided to kind of go the commercial flying route. Other than that little stint in the Air BVI, my flying career has really been in general aviation. You know, anything from a single engine to, you know, King Air 200, you know, and most general aviation airplanes in between, Piper Malibu, jet prop, Navajos, any kind of Cessna stuff. I'll have to look at my logbook, but I'm sure I've got over 35 types, but, probably, yeah, well, you know, about 23,600 hours. And then not counting my 3,000 hours in gliders. So it's been a good ride. It's been a lot of fun, but it's time to let other people pick it up and take off and run with it.
How did you get down to the Antarctic, and what was your role there? Yeah,
that was really cool. Thanks for that, Zoltan. Forgot about that. Anyways, I leased from Boric a King Air 200 for a number of years on Arctic photo projects. we were doing, back in Reagan and Mulrooney's era, they updated the DuLine site. They had all new technology. So if you go back to the DuLine site, it had these major stations all across the Arctic, Cape Dyer, Paul Beach, Cambridge Bay, basically Tuck. And in between, every 40 miles or so, it had all these little infill stations. And then that technology changed and all the little infill stations got shut down. They just had these really big sites. I would encourage people, if they want to get an idea, Google DuLine site Hall Beach, Hall Beach. And they've kept their big radar screens up there because the local community wanted them left as a landmark. They aren't there, they're not active anymore, but there was large domes and these, what looked like the biggest drive-in screen with a slight parabola to it you've ever seen in your life. And the technology changed with backscatter over the horizon radar. And that then created all these little individual radar sites every 40, 50 miles apart. So we had a contract 1 year after that was commissioned and in place to go and fly all of these along in the Canadian airspace. So we did that, and we needed a King Air 200 to do that because of the length and the stretch, because we're going right from Yukon all the way to Cape Dyer on the southeast coast of Baffin Island. And at the same time, doing community photography, we could be running from anywhere from Resolute Bay to Grise Fjord, all the way to basically Fort Liard on the BC border, and everywhere in between. Like I said, there's 64 Indigenous communities, and there's a lot of them, and space in between. We even had the opportunity to go to Alert and fly what was going to be updated imagery for the last 1 to 50,000 map sheet, on the NTS map sheet system. So that was a cool experience to go all the way up to Alert. Basically, there's a mileage sign up there, and if you look at it, Calgary was, I think, 2,430 kilometers, and to go have tea with the Queen was 2,200 kilometers. London was only 2,200 kilometers away. You're on top of the world looking down, so everything has a different perspective from up there. But anyways, working with Boric, and to answer your question, Zoltan, they're a big Arctic operator. And they had started flying in the Antarctic for the United States National Science Foundation. And there was an opportunity for photography. The United States Geological Survey would provide people and cameras to go on a United States Navy Herc. And the Herc that was rigged up for photo survey cartwheeled itself on the ice 1 year and was destroyed. So they lost their photo survey airplane. So pretty much every Twin Otter Boric had was modified with a camera hatch. And so the opportunity came up for them to provide one of their airplanes for photo survey, And so we had the opportunity to provide the photography and the camera and do the job on the ice. So that actually personally fell to me. It's a pretty cool experience. I was going to fly down with the aircraft, but that had to change at the last minute. They would position out of Calgary, fly to Florida, go down to South America from there, and end up in Chile, in the bottom end place called Punta Arenas. And from there, they would, been fighting a bit of a cold. They would position to the Antarctic from there. So I flew, we had our equipment shipped down, and we ended up flying commercial through to Auckland to Christchurch. And then out of Christchurch, we were actually on a Royal New Zealand Air Force Herc, and had an 8-hour flight to McMurdo in the Antarctic. McMurdo is basically United States base in the Antarctic. And the New Zealanders also have their Ross base down there. And that's their basic operation to do their activity on the ice. And it's all about science and research. A lot of different countries are involved down there. And we were doing a variety of survey. We were doing a large penguin colony for population estimate. Was an emperor penguin colony of over 1.5 million birds. It's crazy. There's a phenomena just east of Ross Island where McMurdo is. They're called the dry valleys. So the Antarctic continent is roughly a landmass of 600 feet, but South Pole is 9,600 feet above sea level. I actually got a t-shirt from there. It said ski South Pole, 2-mile base, 2 inches of powder for all you ski buffs. So the Antarctic, or the plateau, the ice in South Pole is 9,600 feet above sea level. These dry valleys, there's basically a adiabatic wind, you know, essentially a Chinook or a fawn wind that comes off the Antarctic plateau. And these dry valleys actually are totally clear of any snow and ice accumulation, and they stay bare and dry, which is pretty unique on the Antarctic continent because it's mostly all ice covered. There's also a really interesting little lake there called Lake Vaughan. And in the summer, that lake has still got an ice cap, I think of about 10 feet thick. And what happens at that lake is the sun goes through and it heats up the water. And what happens, it actually gets really, really warm. It can't get a convection current going. And when you drill down through that ice into the water, it's actually almost warm enough to go for a bath. Pretty crazy. Under a 10-foot ice cap, the water is almost warm enough for a bath, you know. But in any event, we did these dry valleys. We did some limited mapping of dry valleys. One of the main things we were there for was what they call a Sipple Coast study. There's the second largest glacier in the world. It's fed by about 4 different ice streams, and they were between 2 different streams, only 40 miles apart. The speed of the ice streams were exceptionally different. One would move like 40 meters in a month and a half, and the other would move only 40 meters in a whole year. And they were doing ice coring and science on that, trying to get an idea on the feed of the glacier, because this feed on the glacier also caused the glacier to calve and feed into the Antarctic Sea. And that had to do with currents and a lot of climate work or climate activity. So if you're getting more and more ice and basically salt-free water in mixing with the the Antarctic water, affects the currents, affects the upper atmosphere and the climate and stuff. But really interesting experience. We did some photography around South Pole too. They've got, interestingly enough, all these little anecdotic stories that you run into. On Christmas Day, they actually have a race around the South Pole station, because South Pole is right at South Pole, geographically speaking. I happen to be there, so I can sit here with a straight face and tell you I've run around the world 3 times. Now, it only took 3 circuits. It was 2 miles, but I still ran around the world. Anyways, just some of these funny little things that happen in your travels. But it was a good experience. It was only the 1-year opportunity, but it was certainly a lot of fun and kind of a neat thing to do. And you make a small contribution to some of the science and the activity down there.
Thank you.